Mr. Keith.
In the course of this morning's evidence, Dr. Case, we were looking at the government's consideration of whether the consequences of lockdown were so awful that there had to be proper formal consideration of alternatives, and whether or not there was a viable alternative in terms of the weighing up of the issues and the quality analysis. Another part of that debate concerned or involved segmentation. And in July, you discussed the issue of population segmentation with Mark Sedwill. And without any way suggesting that you'd reached concluded positions, you were debating, you were talking around the alternatives, and one of them was I think it was described by him as a Stalinist segmentation, whereby the virus is not permitted to kill the old in the state because nobody ever permits a virus to do anything. But there was a recognition that there could be a system by which, or process by which, part of the population is segmented, shielded essentially.
Yes.
And part of the population is allowed to get on with life after a fashion. What work was done in reality on pursuing segmentation as a policy possibility in the summer of 2020?
If I remember correctly, I think during July, maybe August, early September, work was done to look at this. I think in the end it finished up in a note to the Prime Minister, I think in September, which effectively concluded that large-scale segmentation was impractical, and if I remember correctly, the recommendation was the shielding programme needed to be developed. The version that was ruled out was a very large-scale segmentation. And I think along the way in producing that, there were various conversations with public services, and if I remember correctly, I think maybe even sort of some of the supermarkets and that sort of thing, about the practicalities of large-scale segmentation, i.e. that anybody above a certain age group would be segmented from everyone else. And
so, pausing you there,
sorry.
Segmentation by age.
I think that was the main focus of the work, because the shielding programme, as it were, was segmentation by vulnerability. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but sort of by clinical definition, vulnerability. The work that was done on segmentation was, exactly, it was a crude age thing, where the reality became that you would have to totally divide society in its purest form. Supermarkets would have to be open certain hours of the day when only certain people of certain age could come in. Intergenerational households couldn't function, so it was ruled out as sort of impractical in that sense.
How developed did the thinking become? I mean, what was it appreciated at a relatively early stage that the practicalities made it something that was impossible to pursue, or did it progress after a fashion, but then ultimately run into the ground?
I think it's the latter. I think it was maybe 6 or 8 weeks' work that was done on it. It wasn't a cursory look. As I said, I think there was dialogue with, actually look at the practicalities, but I think was then ruled out in that form. And I'm not aware that on any other form of segmentation, I can't quite think what that would be, but was explored.
I asked you earlier this morning about your acknowledgement of the understandably vocal debate in the public arena about whether or not segmentation and a form of shielding presented itself as a viable alternative to lockdown. And you're obviously aware of the many people who called upon the government to justify the second lockdown and who asked the government, why didn't you contemplate an alternative? Why didn't you put into place a practical alternative to lockdown that would have obviated the need for it? What do you say to them? Why wasn't segmentation or the quality analysis or the other steps that might have been taken to provide the government with an option, an alternative, taken?
2 points for me. We talked about Equalities this morning, and I've acknowledged that was a mistake. On segmentation, I think the version of segmentation that was actually developed, in fact, through the whole pandemic, i.e. shielding of the clinically extremely vulnerable, ended up being the best form of segmentation because it was done by sort of vulnerability to the virus. I think the problem with the age version of segmentation, which was being put forward, because I think there was a crude look at the statistics that said, well, if you're below a certain age, your probability of ending up in hospital or whatever, hospitalization rates are low. Yeah, the problem with that, of course, is that that still ends up admitting that you're allowing some people, as it were, who beat the stats. You're actually allowing that some younger people would get the virus and would be hospitalized and what have you. The other argument I remember being put forward against segmentation was actually, I think it was by Patrick Vallance, was the problem with segmentation was at some point you had to stop, which, of course, once you'd got vaccines, fine. But if you had if you had a segment of the population where, in effect, you were letting the virus circulate rapidly, and it would keep doing that and it would mutate, at what point are you allowing that segment of the population to reintegrate without vaccines or what have you? How do you eventually stop segmenting? I think that was one of actually quite a practical point, which was once you've started doing this, if you've got very high transmission of the virus amongst one set of the population, how do you ever stop if the other side of the population can't get that virus but it's spreading rapidly?
So shades, in fact, of the herd immunity debate.
Yeah, I suppose, yes. Yeah, I think that's right.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was this the position then that the government reached the view that for practical and epidemiological reasons, segmentation as a process to allow society to continue to function without the need for a lockdown proved not to be possible?
Certainly that was the conclusion of the work. Of course, there were lots of other things that we tried to do, in the run-up to the second lockdown to avoid it, tiering, mass testing and all of these sorts of things to desperately try and avoid a second national lockdown.
We'll come to those.
But segmentation was ruled out. I think it was September that the Prime Minister accepted the advice.
Would you acknowledge that the government failed to demonstrate publicly that it was considering any possible alternative to a lockdown if the R rate and the public health arguments otherwise demanded a lockdown? And it failed to make plain that it was considering alternatives. Because in the public arena, at any rate, that the government has been very severely criticised for at least appearing not to have considered anything but a public health-driven lockdown.
I think it's absolutely a very fair criticism. There were a number of occasions where this desire to have simple, clear, unambiguous messages coming out of government about the strategy meant that there wasn't enough engagement on the alternatives. And as you say, I think this is a case where there could have been explanation. There could have been more explanation of what we'd done to explore alternatives and why they didn't work. It was a sort of failure of transparency.
It does rather appear that in relation to a number of issues, the U-turn on exam results, the face mask policy, face covering policy,
Yeah.
the issue of whether or not there was an alternative to lockdown. There was a high degree of confusion, at least in terms of the government's understanding of its own position and what the public made of your position.
Yes, I think absolutely fair. There were times when, almost within a day, a minister would do what we call the morning round, going on the television and radio in the morning and sort of say one thing, and by the end of the day, the government had actually announced a different position. I think that happened on a couple of occasions, which is exactly to say, confused the public because it wasn't giving them the information that, what do you want me to do? What am I supposed to do? There was another period, again, part of that late summer, autumn period, as part of this move to try and find alternatives to lockdown, we made a real drive to put more of the data, more of the dashboard into the public domain, including getting more regional data out there. Because the argument was, if you give people the data, they'll make decisions for themselves about how they lead their lives. I think the problem is we ended up putting so much data out that people couldn't necessarily understand it. That we sort of went from very simple messaging to sort of hyper transparency, and that wasn't very successful either.
In your own WhatsApp to Helen McNamara in August 2020, you described the U-turn on exam results as being the most awful governing I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And you said lots of people should lose their heads. Yeah. Elsewhere, you described the total chaos of government. Explain, please, why or how the government got itself in the position in which there appears to have been U-turns, a lack of a coherent strategy, a lack of a coherent approach being explained to the public, and an extraordinary inability to be able to rationalize a position and then stick to it.
It wasn't for want of trying, I can tell you, and my frustrations are laid bare in the material that you have. Now, some of the explanation is, of course, because of the inherent complexity of the challenge of the virus and the wider impacts of the virus on society, economy, non-COVID health, etc. Some of it is that, as it were, that the new things were learned. The obvious point there is on variants. When new variants turned up, as it were, in that Keynesian sort of thing, the facts had changed, so I changed my mind. But it was also just very difficult, in a sort of human sense, to keep the discipline of government together, to sort of keep everybody on the same page. People had strong views. We tried to keep cohering the view. But weren't always successful. Exams. You mentioned. Exams is a separate issue, and I think you're doing a module on education. The thing about that was sort of very frustrating was, of course, exactly the same thing had happened in Scotland just before. And again, some of us had asked questions about, are we okay? I think it's 2 or 3 weeks before that the Scottish exam results come out, and sort of again said, are we on top of this? Is this going to be okay? And exactly the same thing happened in England. It was frustrating.
Eat out to help out.
Yeah.
My lady's had evidence, quite extensive evidence about that scheme, and there is evidence to suggest, quite plain evidence to suggest that Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance were unaware of it, and that it was, when it was presented to the Cabinet on the 8th of July, some ministers, but particularly Mr. Hancock, for them it was the first time they'd heard of the scheme.
Yeah.
Were you aware that Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vance had not been approached for their views on the scheme?
No, in fact, I wasn't aware of EAT Out to Help Out until it was announced either. It hadn't. I think you've already heard from some, really, it didn't come through the COVID task force, so I don't think we were aware.
You were the permanent secretary in number 10.
Well, permanent secretary in number 10 working on COVID, and it didn't.
But you didn't know about
no,
the
it didn't.
EAT Out to Help
No,
Out scheme?
and I think, you have to, my lady, will I'm sure, try and pull together a coherent account of this. I mean, what is clear is the Prime Minister thought they had been consulted.
Can I assist you? We're not delving into.
Sorry, okay.
We're not delving into the merits of the scheme.
Yeah.
That's for other witnesses and has been for other witnesses, or the impact, or any of the, I suppose, the societal consequences. Just in terms of the process by which the scheme came to be promulgated, it's quite obvious that very few people knew about it.
Yeah, I think because it had been worked up as what we call a budget measure, sort of between, in the Prime Minister Chancellor space where budget work is done. As I say, I didn't know, and actually the concerns about it. In fact, I think I didn't know until late August, actually, when Matt Hancock raised his concerns with me.
Yes, in the context of whether it would be extended or whether
which it wasn't.
He raised
it wasn't
concerns
to be, and I raised that with the Prime Minister, and I think he already knew about the scientists' concern in late August.
Were you saying just a moment ago, Dr. Case, that the Prime Minister thought that people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vance had been consulted?
That's my understanding, is that he thought they had been consulted. Apologies if I've misrepresented his evidence, but certainly my reading of his written evidence, I haven't seen everything that he said to you in oral evidence, was he thought that they had been consulted.
Oh, I see. That's not coming from what you knew at the time.
No, sorry, apologies. No, it's from what I read in the material.
Thank you.
Mr. Sunak, in his witness statement, said the policy was subsequently approved and signed off by number 10. Mr. Johnson said in his statement, before the scheme was implemented, he had discussions with Mr. Sunak and that he understood it had been discussed with the relevant advisors.
Yeah.
Can we now please come to the autumn of 2020? and I want to try to focus on the overarching strategic considerations. By this time, you're, of course, Cabinet Secretary. There is ample material in the WhatsApps and the policy documents, the materials prepared by the COVID task force, to suggest that by the end of August, government knew that the numbers were rising.
Yeah.
The government knew also that one of the primary features of a viral pandemic is the wave, and therefore that a second wave was very likely. And indeed, your own communications show that you discussed with the Prime Minister the emergence of a second wave in France and other Western European countries, and he and you agreed that you'd have to be mad to think that it wouldn't come to the United Kingdom. There was, at the beginning of September, no vaccine.
Correct.
Although there had been a debate about the moonshot project of getting test and trace to a position whereby the population at large...
Yeah, it was mass asymptomatic.
With
testing was the goal, which couldn't be achieved in the timescale.
But by September, October, well, suddenly in September, although there was a great deal of goodwill and a great deal of optimism that it would work, the signs that it wouldn't work were already becoming apparent. So the government was faced with a terrible predicament, was it not? You knew the second wave was coming. You had no practical vaccine-related or test and trace methods at your disposal to deal with the second wave. And therefore you knew you would have to contemplate at some point the possibility of another lockdown with all the terrible consequences that ensued, because you knew from the first lockdown what they were.
Yes.
Is that all a fair summary so far?
it is. I mean, I think it goes. This avoiding second lockdown actually goes right back to May. I think when you read the May roadmap, that roadmap is worth looking at. It talks about harms. You quite soon after, sort of when I started the number 10 at the COVID task force job, we'd already got this mentality. We were using the language of an R budget. I think people will have spoken to you about this concept of R budget. This is mostly in relation to unlocking. I wonder if that didn't actually trap us into a certain way of thinking, which was an R budget. Again, it's sort of one of those a read across from how we do financial budgets, which is the Chancellor will get from somewhere and the Prime Minister will get a forecast, which will have in it, this is how much room you've got to play with, this is how much money you've got to spend on tax cuts or more public service spending. The problem, I think, in the autumn goes, I can make an argument that it actually goes back to the unlocking in the summer. The R budget mentality thought, well, OK, if R is 0.6, that means we've got 0.4 of R to spend, so let's unlock as fast as we can up to the point of 0.4. What we didn't have was an incidence-based measure. In the roadmap, and all the way through the summer, all the way through the autumn, we were trying mass testing, we were trying tiering in ever-strengthening forms, hands, face, space, rule of 6, and all of those little nudges on the tiller that were going on. They may have worked. They could have worked. Test and trace is probably the best example. But they couldn't ever work in a high incidence environment, which is what we had.
Can I pause you there?
Sorry, I'm going off on that.
It's plainly very important. I wanted you to explain some of the thinking about the incidence level. What had the position been, or was the position that in the summer, as part of the roadmap and the easing off, the United Kingdom had been unlocked, eased, at a point at which the levels of circulation of the virus in the population were, relatively speaking, at a higher level than the incidence rates in other comparable Western European countries.
I think there's that's true. I was always told at the time there may be an artifact of the data, which is because we were doing very sophisticated. We had more testing going on than others, but I'm sure it is right that we were unlocking at higher incidence than others, which always made it harder for our measures that we were doing to try and avoid the second lockdown. Probably were less successful because of that high incidence.
And so to some extent, the die were cast by the beginning of September because the United Kingdom had gone beyond the point at which it had made decisions about easing in the roadmap. The incidence levels had remained relatively high and had started to go up. And so by that time, early September, the government's hands had already been tied because anything that you did in terms of rules of 6 or circuit breakers or local restrictions, or as it turned out, tiers, and then a lockdown, were all going to be less effective, or at least alternatively, when imposed, they'd all had to be imposed for longer and to greater and more severe effect. Because you were dealing with a background of a high level of incidence.
Yes. I agree with that articulation. I'd say it's only myself having gone back in the last few weeks in preparation, rereading all this stuff, thinking, was that the big problem? Because I remember discussing with the then Prime Minister, in particular, the German experience where it looked like, it was German and Belgian, where there seemed like relatively small measures that they were doing. Like they brought in a curfew, I think, on their hospitality and their pubs at one point, and it seemed to work in I can't remember which city it was in, but it looked like it worked. And we say, well, why is it such a small measure looks like it's working there? And the answer that we got back from the discussions with Chris and Patrick and the data people was, well, actually, these interventions are happening at a much lower level of incidence. The test and trace was sort of much maligned through the autumn as not being effective. Actually, I think it was an impossible job that we set them because incidence was so high, unlike in Germany and other examples of test and trace, where if you've got a very small number of people with the virus, low incidence, and you go in with a test and trace mechanism, you have a pretty good chance of actually locking down that outbreak. If you've got the virus, we were talking all the time about, Chris Whitty used to talk about a number of pandemics going on at the same time. There was the pandemic in the general population, there was the pandemic in hospitals, and then there was the pandemic in care homes. The problem is our pandemic in the general population, the incidence remained so high that these measures couldn't work as effectively as they did elsewhere.
And so, is this the position, Dr. Case? There were a number of serious failings on the part of the government. One, and it's a problem that you faced throughout the whole of 2020, there had been no scaled up test and trace process which would have allowed you a way out of the conundrum.
Correct, yeah.
Two, you had eased off too much in the summer, which had allowed incidence levels of circulation of the virus to remain high, which came back to haunt you in the autumn because it then restricted your freedom of manoeuvre when it came to dealing with the rocketing rates in the autumn. Three, in the autumn, although some people had called for a circuit breaker, and Spy MO had called for a circuit breaker, Mr. Cummings had called for a circuit breaker, a number of others, the government didn't impose a circuit breaker in September, but instead tried the tier process in October.
Yes, correct.
But those two decisions proved to be inadequate to deal with the rocketing rate of the virus.
Correct.
So that's the third failing. And then the fourth problem, perhaps not a failing, but a problem, was that in trying to resolve what should be done, there was a high level of confusion at the heart of government, perhaps reflective of how impossible a task it was. You were being, as you described, buffeted by significant internal and external pressures. Bluntly, you just couldn't see your way out of the sack that you were in.
Yeah, and as we discussed this morning, the consciousness around the harms, the hidden and sort of less hidden harms, was a real, much more part of the conversation in the internal decision making. And there's this sort of expression I think that gets used about boiling frogs. I don't know if you ever heard. I won't bother. But this idea that we'd sort of got trapped into a way of thinking and wrestling that meant we couldn't actually see what was really happening and take the decisive action. That sort of prisoners of our own mentality, which was we were desperate to avoid another lockdown. There was just all these attempts to try and come up with solutions, and we were just prisoners of our own thinking.
And bluntly, the government, as we've discussed, the structures and the processes and the systems for allowing you to release yourself from your own self-imposed prison were not up to the job.
The debate was there. We just couldn't bring it to a conclusion. As you said, interestingly, circuit breakers, the idea of circuit breakers had come up, I think, in several papers that were put to Covid-S, even before SAGE on the 21st of September had included it in one of their options.
First week of September, SPIMO raised it.
It was, I think it was, if I remember it, it was in papers in July and August, this idea of circuit breakers. So, but the debate was there about it, but we just couldn't take the decision. Just couldn't get the agreement to do something other than just keep trying all these things desperately to avoid a national lockdown. And, now it looks like it's sort of, you wonder how on earth did we make that mistake? At the time, it felt like just reasonable attempt after reasonable attempt to avoid that second lockdown because it was so damaging. The language at the time, and this isn't, about, in particular, every time you get an economic sort of crisis or dip or crash, one of the long-term effects, in particular, is youth unemployment and the unemployment at lower end of the wages, which, that part of our workforce, it was then, is disproportionately female, young, and ethnic minority. These were in all of the forecasts. These were the sorts of things that were being discussed. These are, call it scarring. Economists sort of call it long-term scarring in the economy. Human beings who lose their job and then can't get jobs for a very long time. This is the sort. Sorry, I'm going on. This was the sort of debate that was playing out, and we just couldn't get out of the clarity of thought that probably was needed.
On the 22nd of September, the Prime Minister announced his decision, which is that instead of there being a circuit breaker, which was one of the options on the short list of options proposed by SAGE and SPIMO and latterly by Covid-S, there would be a mixture of options, a mixture of packages A and B.
Oh, yeah.
The early closing of pubs and bars, table service only, expanded face coverings, and so on, and a call to work from home. So that opportunity for a circuit breaker, which might, and one can't put it any higher than that, but that is the word that Sir Chris Whitty used, might have made a difference in terms of obviating the need for a lockdown later, or at least shortening its length. Might have made a difference. That opportunity was lost.
Yeah, because interesting is the wrong word. There is, interestingly, a counterfactual on the circuit breaker in that the Welsh government did decide to do the circuit breaker. I think it had some impact, but not
But the
huge
reason
impact.
the reason it didn't was for the same reasons you've already expanded upon, which is that by then the incidence rate was so high
I agree.
that it wasn't going to work.
Yes.
And Sir Chris Whitty has already rationalised that issue and had already rationalised that point when he said a circuit breaker in September, if that opportunity had been taken, might have made the difference. Secondly, the tiers. Mr. Hancock has said in evidence that he knew that tiers wouldn't work. Would it be fair to say that tiers implemented as they were?
At the time they were as well, I don't think were going to work. We didn't see it at the time. I didn't have that same clarity of thought that Mr. Hancock says. I think we thought they were going to work. I think Chris and Patrick were very concerned that tiering there were all these, remember tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They were very concerned that basic tier 3 wouldn't work. We had to go to the top end of tier 3 and all this sort of thing.
They said on the 11th of October, the level 3 baseline was highly unlikely to work. So even before tiers were imposed, which they were by public announcement on the 12th of October, the scientific advisors were concerned about.
They were concerned about the low
baseline.
level. Actually, the first tier 3, which was agreed voluntarily with, I think it was Steve Rotherham, who was, I think you might have heard from or had evidence from, was the mayor in Liverpool. He actually agreed that they needed to go in at the top end of tier 3. It wasn't the bottom end. And then I think we had Manchester not long afterwards, which had to be imposed. It couldn't be negotiated. But sorry,
yes, Liverpool
this
on
is
the 14th, Greater Manchester on the 20th into Tier 3,
Yeah.
then South Yorkshire, Coventry, Slough and Stoke-on-Trent, Tier 2.
This is all detail you know. I agree with Chris Whitty. Could tiering have worked if we'd started earlier at a higher level? Possibly it could have done. It's another of those what-if moments that... But I think, as you said a number of times and we agree on, the high incidence through late summer and autumn was the thing that was the underlying current, if you like, that we were swimming against.
So to stand back then, from its decision on easing in the summer, the government had put itself in a position whereby its options became much more limited.
Yeah.
It eased off too soon. It was an outlier in that regard, and the chickens came home to roost in the autumn.
Yeah. And contrasts, if I may.
Yes.
You know, with the lesson being learnt, different world, third lockdown, roadmap, vaccines. But the crucial thing about data, not dates, which I know you've heard evidence on, or had written evidence on, was the thing. The unlocking in the May roadmap was done by date, and it was a very clear drumbeat. It wasn't the decisions to unlock were it was a rhythm that was predetermined. Yes, we delayed one step, I think, in the late summer. Was it July? I think we delayed by 2 weeks one element. But that roadmap to get out of the third lockdown was all about the conditions had to be right to let us unlock.
You failed to avail yourself of the opportunity of a circuit breaker in September when it might have made a difference. You put into place a tier system which was fundamentally flawed and quickly came to an end. There was, you've already agreed, an insufficient analysis concerning alternatives to lockdown. Quali analysis, segmentation tried, but for practical and epidemiological reasons couldn't be pursued. And so by the end of October, isn't the nub of it that the government left itself with no option but to self-impose a lockdown?
Yes.
And to make matters worse, do you acknowledge that it's now recognised that there isn't really a hard-edged balance between public health outcomes and economic damage? Because a lockdown, if imposed earlier, when incidence is lower, is likely to be shorter and less devastating than the lockdown which you in fact imposed.
Those are my instincts as well. I know that this has been looked at. I think it was either earlier this year or earlier last year, the Royal Society looked at this question of, these questions of NPIs and what form worked and how, and they struggled to quantify. The Royal Society doing, I think it was a global literature search, and they struggled to be clear a couple of years on that the evidence was there. That was, as you put it, Mr. Keith, that was certainly, that sort of feels instinctively right. I've not seen the serious data evidence-driven thing that really proves that. But I agree with your instinct.
But on the 20th of September, the Prime Minister convened that roundtable scientific discussion, which I think you organised and perhaps you in fact called for. Although I think parentage is perhaps disputed because Sir Patrick Vallance has said that perhaps he'd called for it. But in any event, the Prime Minister received the ideas of Professor Gupta, Professor Carl Hennigan, because he wanted to hear alternative views to, because he'd been criticised quite roundly in the press to the effect that he'd been receiving the wrong scientific advice. And to be fair, the former Prime Minister made plain that he knew the views of Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance. He knew of course he knew the public health debate, and he knew what factors weighed heavily in favour of a lockdown. But he wanted to hear the opposing argument. At that meeting, and you were there,
Yes.
did Professor Gupta and Professor Hennigan, whilst faithfully advancing their positions, in fact argue forcefully for there to be no intervention? Putting it another way, how strongly did they advance the anti-lockdown case as it happened?
Sort of this meeting sort of achieved perhaps mythical status afterwards. I don't personally remember really strong anti-lockdown cases being put forward. In fact, I think it was. I've exhibited it in my evidence. In fact, each of the individuals that were there submitted a page or two to sort of summarise. So if I've misremembered wrong, I apologise. Actually, I thought probably the most interesting contribution to that meeting was from, apologies if I get his name wrong, but I think it was Anders Tegnell, who was Sweden, who described, there were a lot of people saying, well, why, and still are saying, why didn't we do the Swedish model? But he gave a very astute observation about how society in Sweden works very differently. They did very little through the law. That's actually the contribution that sort of stood out. And of course, we had people, I think John Edmonds was there, if I remember correctly as well, who was putting forward a stronger lockdown case. So it was an interesting discussion, but I don't think it sort of was the lightning sort of rod. It wasn't quite the shard of light on the whole thing that maybe some people have made it out to be.
But it's important to acknowledge, isn't it, that the government, and then particularly Mr. Johnson, took steps to inform himself of the bona fide and the genuine and rational arguments advanced by those who were concerned about the prospect of a second lockdown.
Yes.
But the reality was, as you've now
By
agreed,
late September.
by late September, it was just already too late, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The die had been cast because of the earlier failures.
Yeah, I think, as I say, I think it goes back to.
And I think you accept, and you said in a WhatsApp that or at least I'm afraid I was just about to verbal you, Dr. Case. Sir Patrick Vallon says in his evening notes that you said to him, following the decision that a second lockdown be imposed, they should have done this a month ago.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's obviously not, as we've discussed there earlier, there could have been other things that were done.
No, quite.
Differently.
So, actually, the government was in the very worst of all worlds. It missed the opportunities to avoid a lockdown, and then through its own failings, having predetermined that there would have to be a lockdown because of the earlier decisions, it then failed to impose it speedily enough.
Yeah, I think Chris Wormold, I said to you about these things should have been imposed sort of 2 weeks earlier, and I think that feels right.
So whichever way, in fact, whichever angle one approaches these extremely difficult decisions, the government erred on almost every level.
Yes, clearly with hindsight, absolutely clear that all of the steps, as I say, the sort of the thought and the discussion that we've been having about the incidents, I think, goes back. I think at the time, as I said, it was a desperate attempt to avoid a second lockdown because of the consequences of that second lockdown.
Of course.
And so, as you say, we erred, but we erred because of the building up of a series of decisions. As you said, actually, you put it, that in the end we had no choice to do it, because all the things that we tried, we either didn't try early enough or hard enough, or we unlocked too early.
It's self-induced lack of intent, Dr. Case. You erred because of your earlier governmental decisions. You said in a WhatsApp with Helen McNamara, we're back here, this is after the decision was taken, the second lockdown decision, because the state has failed. You didn't say, we are back here because the nature of this virus, its tendency to re-emerge epidemiologically as a second wave, because of the societal and economic nature and makeup of this country, we've just had no option but to reimpose a lockdown. You said the state has failed and we have some massive questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah, it was, so I mean, I think was that the evening before the Prime Minister announced the lockdown, or the day of, I can't remember. That's what it felt like. It felt, it was how have we, we have tried, I think, at every stage to act through the best of intentions to find the right balance to avoid these harms, but yet we just didn't come up with the right answer. It was a very dark day.
Yes. Lady, is that a convenient point for the next break? I've only about 10 minutes more to go.
I was going to go a bit longer. If that's, you okay?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Barnard Castle. Mr. Cummings drove to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight and then gave a press conference in May to explain his driving. In Sir Patrick Vallance's diaries around that time, the 25th of May, he suggests that he and Sir Chris Whitty came under considerable pressure from you to attend and be seen to join a press conference. It's not at all clear whether it was Mr. Cummings' press conference or a later one. I suspect a later one with Mr. Johnson. And Sir Patrick complained in his diary and gave evidence to this effect that Simon Case had a go at us, had tried to persuade them to join what was a highly political press conference.
I think you're reading that the wrong way round, aren't you? I'd had a go. He'd rung me up and said, we don't want to appear, and I'd had a go at trying to get them out of the... It's the other way round. I think that's
what he means by had a go.
Had a go, not at him. I had a go at trying to get them out of the press conference.
Right.
And I think, actually, in the end, the person who brought sort of total clarity, I think, was actually... They ended up arriving at Downing Street, I think, if I remember correctly, and bumped into Dom Cummings. And Dom Cummings was the one who said, of course you can't appear. I think it was to do with the Prime Minister's press conference that evening.
After the Rose Garden.
And actually, I think it was Dominic Cummings who said, of course you can't be there because you'll be asked all about Barnard Castle.
You state in your witness statement your belief that the breaches registered with the public, they eroded public trust in the legitimacy of the government's response to COVID, and together with the confused communications and the complex and confusing guidance, led to a very significant dropping off in the public's adherence to COVID rules.
And I mean, I've exhibited that they were doing tracking polling on people's confidence in the government response, and I think actually through late April into May and all this, it just declined. And after the clarity of stay home, sort of save lives, protect the NHS, the muddle, I think, made it very difficult for the public to sort of understand and trust what the government was trying to do. And of course, much later on with with Partygate and all that sort of thing. You know, it's just, you know.
It was a terrible self-imposed wound.
I mean, and it sort of, I'm sure, to the bereaved, sort of feels like a terrible insult.
You've given evidence today, if I may say so very candidly, although it's a matter for my lady, of course, as always. You've accepted a very significant number of failings on the part of the government, and you've described the root causes of those failings, responsibility for which cannot be placed solely at the door of the virus, no. But it has to be placed at the door of number 10.
Well, on all of our shoulders, all of us who were there at the time.
You must have given, since those terrible events, a great deal of thought as to the root cause of the dysfunctionality, if you agree that's what it was in number 10. The issue of data was ultimately resolved. Thanks to you, the issue of structure was ultimately resolved with the CTF, the COVID task force. But the dysfunctionality continued, it would appear. What was the root cause of that?
Between us, we couldn't get the right balance of personalities and people. It took us too long to get those things right.
Is that why you've agreed today and in your witness statement and in your WhatsApps that the government failed at a number of fundamental levels and contributed to the worst governing, to use your words, ever seen?
There's language in those WhatsApps that we've discussed. They come out of a raw human in the moment. It's not a roundly considered view in those moments, but yeah, I felt there were some dark days when it felt we just couldn't get it right.
Happily, Dr. Case, you are our Cabinet Secretary. What can the civil service do to help prevent this sort of unhappy tale ever occurring again?
I think decisions are sort of a consequence of a number of... Oh, sorry to the tech people. A sort of consequence of a number of different inputs. Sorry to use that language, but just allow me for a moment. There's what's happening in the world. So that's sort of the data, your understanding of the world. There's processes. Very much the domain of the civil service is making sure we've got the right processes in place to support good decision making. Actually, I think we were very conscious, certainly I know during the COVID task force time and the COVID-O, we had ringing in our ears the criticisms of the Blair government around the decision-taking around Iraq, when there were absolutely, it was sofa government galore and the processes didn't work. So we ended up getting there. They're also a function of two other things. So one of them is the characters and the personalities. And in particular, obviously, it's always been true in politics that senior ministers, prime ministers are a big part of that. What can you do about that? Well, some of that is about the structures and processes and the people you put around them to manage those characters. But there's a limit. Democracy is the thing that gives us the Prime Minister of the day. And if that's the Prime Minister of the day, people like me have to do our best to try and, work with, what the electorate give the country or want for the country. The final thing, which we haven't touched on, and I don't know to what extent it's in the scope of Milady's sort of thinking, is actually scrutiny, external scrutiny. if you think about how government really works and the pressures, why do governments act? Well, actually, pressures from outside, not of the data sort and what's happening in the real world, but what does Parliament think? What does your political party think? What's the media saying? How's the public reacting? And it's a cabinet minister, a current serving cabinet minister recently put it to me that one of the big mistakes was Parliament not functioning properly. Parliament is a thing that obviously exercises real scrutiny and control. It's one of the things that holds the executive true and to account. And actually, parliamentary scrutiny didn't really work in the way that it does in normal times, because obviously Parliament wanted to follow the same rules as everyone else. But that for me is one of the pressures that is a really important thing in the day-to-day of how government approaches its decisions, and it didn't function like it normally does.
Can I ask, one of the things that concerns me, you mentioned there lessons learned from what you called the sofa government of Tony Blair and the decision to invade Iraq. Do I get the impression that lessons may be learned for a few weeks or a few months, but then are forgotten? I mean, COVID-S, is that an example? I mean, everyone knew it worked for Brexit. It seemed to have been quite efficient.
Yes.
But
so,
then,
yeah, I think
didn't someone think of it immediately?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I
appreciate you weren't there.
No, but when I came back and I heard about how it had been functioning, this is actually a really rather good model of managing all of this. And Helen McNamara felt the same thing, which is why we recommended it to the Prime Minister. Some lessons do get learnt for a short time in the way that you put. But I mean, there's other things. There's a sort of go back to the Iraq inquiry, but the Chilcot checklist, something it's in there, but it was recommended. Every time ministers meet now to take decisions of matters of peace and war, or as on Ukraine or the Red Sea at the moment, the Chilcot checklist sits there as a reminder of the things that need, as a matter of good government and good decision taking, these are the things. So I think there are some lessons that really stick. I think the ones that are really difficult are the cultural ones. So I'm sort of very conscious. The civil service today isn't the civil service of the sort of 1950s and 60s. We've got a lot more to do to change who we are and where we're from and what our skills are. Cultural change is really difficult and needs long, consistent commitment to that change. And I think those are the things that are the ones that are really difficult to make stick.
Totally understand that. Changing culture, something that I've worked with over the years, and I know how difficult it can be. But can I go back to my point about learning lessons? So, for example, when the pandemic struck, we had to scale up infrastructure and get things to be flexible, get manufacturers to do things they hadn't been doing before. To what extent have we, since the pandemic, said, all right, we're out of the pandemic, and these structures have been dismantled?
Some have, not all. So, one of the lasting changes is what we call now the UK HSA, the Health Security Agency. There's material that I've submitted on in the summer of 2020. We were focused on creating the equivalent of the American Centre for Disease Control. So there's a good example of a lasting structural change, deliberately designed to be at the heart of the next, should we have another pandemic or outbreak of anything, there at the heart, still in its infancy as an organisation. There are other things we've done structurally. It's often our way in sort of the bureaucratic world. So a national situation centre, which is now a permanent thing, it's there along with our joint data analysis centre. Sorry, more of this sort of alphabet spaghetti stuff. But we've created these structures to answer the challenges. The thing that, of course, is our real problem is the Singapore problem. You build your guns pointing in the wrong direction because those are the lessons of the last war. And that's the thing that we have to, we can see the elements. You'll need things like data. You'll need good structures and processes, which I hope COVID-S and COVID-O or XSXO continues. I think it is a good model. It's actually not a million miles away from an approach that Tony Blair took in his second administration with his Prime Minister's delivery unit, of just getting ministers and people who deliver things around the table and talk about what works and what doesn't. They're there. So the structural changes, I think, are coming. We've changed how we do our resilience and planning, and this may be something that you've heard evidence on in Module 1. One of the mistakes that I think we made one of the problems we had at the start of COVID was that the Civil Contingency Secretariat that ran COBRA, they're actually responsible for running the immediate crisis response, but they were also responsible for the long-term, what we call resilience planning. How do you get these things right in the long term? We've since separated those out. So again, the immediate of running COBRA meetings on whatever isn't crowding out long-term thinking that has to be decades long. And perhaps the other thing is increasingly, the more we go to the 20th century and 21st century, the answer to these problems don't just lie in government. There are things that we've got to get right. But as we've already discussed on the non-shielded vulnerables, so many of those things were actually down to individual police officers, social workers, whatever. So much of the answer to this lie in the private sector. So getting the relationship right between government and its thinking and the private sector is vital too. Sorry, I'm going on.
Well, I invited you to offer your thoughts.
Sorry,
a lot of what we needed but didn't have were things like arrangements with manufacturers to produce PPE or laboratory facilities, although obviously a great deal of fantastic work was done by way of research. But to what extent are the civil service currently ensuring they have in place arrangements that can just step in a national civil emergency and say, right, you might normally manufacture raincoats, but you're going to be manufacturing PPE once we work out what kind of virus we're protecting people from?
I understand the point. And of course, the civil service does advise on those things, but they have to be ministers. There has to be ministers that decide that we are going to spend taxpayers' money on that sort of resilience. We can give all of the advice we like, which is we need to be better prepared, we need to have sort of dual-use factories, those sorts of things, but ministers decide in the end how to use taxpayers' money.
Well, that brings me to my final question, very neatly. Sorry. I have heard it said by some experienced politicians that the trouble with being a minister in power is that the temptation is to focus on the immediate and not the long term.
Yeah.
To handle the crisis that's before you, not prepare for the crisis that might come next year.
Yeah.
How can one increase the importance of preparedness and resilience and having in place the necessary infrastructure to respond to a crisis with ministers where the natural temptation is, well, that I may spend a fortune on that, as you say, and then it may not get used.
Yeah.
As opposed to making sure that even if I spend a fortune on that, the public will understand because we're preparing for a pandemic. Memories fade.
Yes.
Apart from those who sadly lost loved ones or suffered terribly during the pandemic, memories are fading. So how do we keep the politicians thinking of it, and how do we keep the public on side supporting them in their decisions?
Two things. I think this is where, sorry to sound like the bureaucrat, is actually the structures matter. So, we now have a National Security Council subgroup that sits all the time under the chairmanship of the Deputy Prime Minister on resilience. It is thinking about these long-term problems and, it's there. And actually keeping those structures going. The things that, of course, ministers, they're reacting to politics, they're reacting to what the public demand, but it does rely on people like me and my colleagues saying, well, actually, you do need this National Security Council subset on this, because we do need to keep coming back to you on an annual basis or whatever with our pandemic preparedness plan. So I think actually structures, trying to get consistency of structure, which of course is we don't want to go too far. The criticism of the civil service is we cling too much to structures that are outdated. But some of those really important things I think you can do. And on the public, I think, again, it comes back to transparency as in answer to sort of some of Mr. Keith's questions. It's quite, to a lot of people, it looks like dull stuff. Why is the government spending money on this? You know, I want this thing immediately now, and the government saying, well, we've got to set aside hundreds of millions of pounds for a rainy day sort of preparation. And as you sort of heard, you can have a great pandemic flu preparedness plan and be told they have, and it turns out that's not the pandemic that hits you. You have to be careful. So I think the answer has to lie in communicating around more generic capabilities that can be turned, not just to a pandemic, but something else. You know, you suddenly find yourself at, well, I mean, Russia decides to invade Ukraine, huge challenge. Where are we going to get our energy supplies from? Right, well, it turns out that investment in alternatives to gas turned out to be a really rather important thing that we've done. You have to do, you have to do that. And I should add on, there is a group in Parliament under the chairmanship of Bernard Jenkin, who chairs the liaison committee that brings all of the other select committee chairs together to think about how Parliament can play its role in driving strategic thinking more into government through its scrutiny function. There's nothing like making government think harder about strategy and long-term thinking if permanent secretaries and ministers are regularly in front of Parliament having to answer questions about how are you doing on that long-term thinking.
Thank you very much. Have you completed your questioning?
My lady, Miss Nimmo, who misses nothing, has just reminded me there are two more questions, which, with your permission.
Oh, from you? Oh, yes, of course.
Would the attendance of the Minister for Disabled People or the Minister for Equalities at COVID-O and COVID-S have been a more suitable mechanism for ensuring that the interests of vulnerable groups were properly taken into account in the decision making?
Yeah, I think that's a strong argument, because they're supported by Equalities Hub. There's a machinery that supports them, so I think that would be valuable. I omitted earlier to ask you to confirm what might be thought to be fairly obvious, which is that the impact of Mark Sedwell's departure and the process by which he came to depart in September in the summer of 2020, caused considerable damage to civil service morale and the general functioning in those higher echelons of government. Yeah, it was really destabilising. And the third and final question is, well, it's more of a comment. What you've said about structures and COVID-O and COVID-S, XO, XO, XS, and so on, doesn't really address and can't address fundamentally the issue that of which you spoke, which is that one of the undoubted benefits of democracy is you get what you vote for. Yeah.
Right, we shall break now. I shall return at 3:30 for the last session. Dr. Case, thank you for your help.
All rise.
Ms. Mitchell.
I'm obliged, my lady. Dr. Case, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. I just have a few questions to ask you this afternoon. We've heard earlier on in your evidence about the interaction or lack of it between the then Prime Minister and the ministers of devolved administrations, in particular the First Ministers. So we understand that background, but what I would like to understand is what, if any, formal structures were in place at senior civil service level to allow for you as Cabinet Secretary to liaise with the heads of departments of the civil service in the devolved administrations?
Yeah. So a number of different structures. The one that I actually chair a weekly meeting of permanent secretaries, which obviously all the way through this period was largely focused on COVID. And there were actually a second meeting each week through a good chunk of 2020 where we'd come together. In addition to that, there were, we've already talked about the Chief Medical Officer, who's a permanent secretary equivalent, meeting regularly with his Chief Medical Officer counterparts. And the final one is Sue Gray, who was our permanent secretary who oversaw the relationship with the devolved administration. She also had weekly meetings with a permanent secretary and other counterparts from the devolved administrations.
And in particular, the group that you chaired,
Yeah.
did you find that a useful tool in discussions with the devolved administrations? What benefit did that bring?
Well, I think actually incredibly valuable. Particularly those meetings tend to be they were more sort of free-flowing discussions about the issues and challenges that we were facing. Other meetings have sort of set agenda and that sort of thing, but those more free-flowing discussions with counterparts about, well, we're seeing this, how's this working? I think that's real sort of value in understanding where you are, with your counterparts.
We've also heard that you talked about the absolute importance of structures, particularly in a pandemic. And given, as our leadership has reflected, that we're looking to learn lessons from the pandemic, were there any additional structures which you would have liked to have been in place to ensure cooperation between the UK government and the devolved administration? And I should explain the reason that I'm asking is that we heard, for example, earlier in your evidence, you talked about the issues of politics and personality. And I'm wondering if we can learn from the experiences that we have had to try and limit as much as possible those difficulties in providing some form of structure.
Yeah, I think, it's a very good thought, I think it probably would be valuable to have, actually not just in pandemic, but in emergencies, having a sort of set structure about senior official engagement. That tends to happen around the COBRA table, of course, but again, that's not really the point. The point is when we get in, as we were discussing with Milady earlier, it's actually the chronic phase is the really difficult one. So actually having sort of set structures around that engagement, I think, would be valuable.
And can you envisage as to how that would look? For example, who would it be important to have at those meetings?
So I certainly think you'd want permanent secretary colleagues from the devolved administrations and perhaps other sort of key senior officials. And then, depending on the nature of the crisis, the cabinet secretary might be the national security advisor. And of course, if we follow through the model, if it's a very serious scale, and you've actually got a task force lead, you'd want them in there, and potentially the most relevant departments. So I think you'd want that blend of experience and viewpoints.
And what benefit do you think that would bring?
I think you are. I think the point stands from your earlier question, which is there's always the reality of politics is there's always going to be politics and personalities. By the way, you're not guaranteed there aren't personalities at senior official level. They're not. Some of them aren't shrinking violets. But that would allow the discussions perhaps slightly freer of politics to go on. I think that would be the value.
Can I move on then to ask about an issue which you raised in your statement? I don't need it brought up, but you spoke in relation to the information given to the public about COVID and the regulations and the guidance, and you explained, and as indeed we've heard from others, that it was complex and confusing. You referenced the stay alert message, but you also say, and just for reference, this is at paragraph 629 of your statement for the inquiry, that the complexity of the rules was symptomatic of how the response to the pandemic had strained the balance and interaction between the UK, devolved and local administrations. What I would like to ask you is, how do you consider that the balance and interaction between the UK and devolved administrations was strained?
I think, I mean, I sort of, I'm just adding to the evidence that you've heard, that what I'm really talking about is the personality differences and the fact that I think particularly in relation to Great Britain, where it is a sort of single epidemiological zone, people interacting across all of those boundaries, but we actually had different rules in place in different parts of Great Britain within an epidemiological zone. And I mean, that's what I sort of mean by the strain.
And can I then ask whether or not there were any practical steps taken to try and rectify those strains? Was there anything done
to refer
to
back,
ease it?
Refer back to the earlier points. I think in particular the 4 CMOs meeting was absolutely vital in keeping the flow of information and the discussion about either individual or collective action. There were also important moments. If I remember correctly, I think it was in September 2020, we did a 4 nations joint statement. There were moments like that I think were important about recognising I think it said we recognised there's a second wave coming. But those sorts of structures, the ones that we've already mentioned, I think were the answer.
So the answer to our first and second questions, that if we have better communications, not only at a governmental level, but also at a civil service level, then that will assist managing personality and the inevitable strains. Were there any attempts made at the time, other than the CMOs? Were there any person-to-person civil servant attempts to make matters
better,
run more smoothly? Yes.
So, as I mentioned, the main one was Sue Gray's weekly meetings across the devolved nations. That was important. There were very particular moments of tension where I would speak directly to my counterparts. Just pick up the phone to one of my permanent secretary counterparts to say, are we there's a bit of politics going on here. How do we get through this? So there were a lot of, and there was a lot of sort of civil service. I mean, we're colleagues. We work together day in, day out. So that was happening, all the time.
I'm obliged. I had one more question, my lady, but that's been covered. I'm obliged to my learned friend counsel to the inquiry. So those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell.
I'm obliged.
Mr Metzer, he usually sits behind Ms Mitchell. Oh, he is there. Mr Metzer.
My lady. Dr. Case, I should be asking you a few questions about one topic only on behalf of the long COVID groups. You were part of a WhatsApp group, including the then Prime Minister. On the 17th of May 2020, he shared an article about people suffering from the prolonged symptoms of COVID-19, and I would wonder if we can please call up 2087. Yeah, 102087.
Yeah. I think that's come up.
Thank you. As a direct result of this article, was any advice sought on the prolonged symptoms of COVID-19?
I'm afraid I can't remember whether this particular interaction sparked advice. I remember, I think it's probably later in 2020, probably into the late summer, maybe the autumn, when I think it was Chris Whitty started to talk about long COVID in the meetings with the Prime Minister. But I'm afraid I can't, I mean, I'm happy to check. I don't know whether it's possible to check and come back. I don't know whether that route's available, but I can't tell you I know for sure.
Yes, I think that is, you're right to recall that, but that is much later in time. The Cabinet Office received advice from the DHSC on the 25th of June 2020. We don't need to call it up, but it's 69853, that there could well be a number of longer-term health impacts of COVID-19. You described the role of the COVID task force, and for reference, it's paragraph 3.10 of your corporate statement. We don't need to go to it. As ensuring the government received the most up-to-date advice on the state of play on the ground, was guided by the science, and these words I emphasise, continued to adopt a holistic approach to decision-making to ensure that the impact of all decisions was assessed in the round. That's what you said. Can you assist, please, then, as to why it took not until April 2021 for the CTF to prepare advice for Cabinet Office on the long-term effects of COVID-19?
So if I remember correctly, in the autumn of 2020, what I remember is sort of, as I say, Chris Whitty talking to the Prime Minister, with the COVID task force people in the room, about the possibilities of there, being long-term effects of COVID. I can't tell you precisely why that piece of advice came at that particular time. I can't remember quite what the moment was, but I can tell you that advice was coming straight from. I mean, probably advice is strong. Sort of commentary about the development of the understanding of long COVID, as we later called it, was coming from Chris directly to the Prime Minister.
Yes, that is later in time, but you accept that's a 10-month delay, and I'm just particularly going to ask you about a parliamentary paper on short and long-term effects of COVID-19, which was published in early September 2020. That's 23854, we don't need to go to it. Yeah. Can you assist as to why couldn't the COVID task force prepare something similar at that time?
I don't. The direct answer is I don't know. I don't know who sort of saw it and what was done with the parliamentary advice. What I recall, I think I recall this, as I think it was Patrick, in and around that late summer, early autumn time. Actually, it was a little bit, I think, alongside the discussions around segmentation that Mr. Keith was asking me about earlier, was this idea that it was just fine for children to get COVID because they'd bounced through it. I seem to remember Patrick being clear that it wasn't that straightforward, and that, in fact, the impacts, there could well be lasting impacts of COVID. I can't tell you what precisely was done. I'm happy to check on that parliamentary report and who saw it.
Yes. Well, I simply wanted just to ask you whether, in principle, the COVID task force could, I suggest, prepared something similar.
Yeah.
So help me then with this. How could Cabinet Office factor long COVID into decisions around NPIs, including the imposition of the later lockdowns, if they were not provided with either timely advice or data on it?
I think, if I remember correctly, in the papers that were coming to COVID-S and COVID-O around the decisions around the second lockdown, there were discussions or references in that to the long-term impact of COVID. So I think it was discussed. I'm not going to pretend I think it was discussed in detail. I think it was much more in 2021, but in if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's in the papers of COVID-O. Apologies if I've misremembered.
In greatest respect, I'm not sure you are right.
Okay,
about
sorry,
that.
apologies.
Well, do you agree in principle
Yes.
that it's necessary, if you're going to factor in long COVID into decisions around MPIs, to have timely advice and data?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm going to suggest to you finally that, simply put, was it that Cabinet Office did not take into account that a significant number of people would suffer long-term effects of COVID-19 when carrying out that balancing exercise required to make a decision to lockdown?
I think that's true to an extent in relation to the 2020 period. I think in 2021 it factored more in the decision taking.
Yes, I think.
But of course that's unlocking though.
The second and third lockdowns. So you agree with me on
that?
that? Thank you very much indeed. That's all I ask.
Thank you very much, Mr. Metzer. Ms Davis. Ms Davis over that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. I'm going to press this.
Have you got a green light?
I know. Yes, now I have.
This reminds you of COVID. You're on mute.
I am asking questions on behalf of Sample Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid.
Yeah.
So you will know from that my focus of inquiry is about domestic abuse. And you may want to look at me, but it would be helpful if you could direct your answers to Her Ladyship, and that's not being rude to me at all. So,
Thank you.
And my questions derive from some of the questioning this morning to you in two chunks. One was about the non-shielded vulnerable that you took responsibility for when you came back into government at the beginning of April. And the other was a later chunk on domestic abuse. So you referred to this in your evidence. When you came back into government at the beginning of April, you were looking at SROs, senior responsible officers, very early on, and you were looking at non-shielded vulnerable. And you wrote in an email to Michael Gove, and that's what you referred to in your evidence. I'm not going to ask them to bring it up, but for the reference, it's 137204, and it was the 7th of April. And you said that there was a great deal of work going on now that you'd looked at it. There were myriad SROs working away, but they were working away in silos, and they were not sufficiently joined up. So that was your view.
Yes.
As of the 7th of April. And we've in fact seen, we have two documents that show the programmes for the SROs. There were 10 SROs. They included non-shielded vulnerable, and I think you became that SRO.
Correct.
And they included vulnerable children. There was no separate SRO for domestic abuse.
I can't remember without, but
There are lists.
I'll take your word for it.
Right, yeah, thank you. And then you reported to Cabinet on the 24th of April, and this is a document that, if we can bring up 88638, please. And now I'm aware that you haven't had notice of this document. You may not have had a chance to review it in your preparations. But those are the Cabinet Ministers' minutes of the 24th of April. Do we have them up?
Yes, they're that.
Good. And on page 1, we can see that that's the date and the Minister's present. On page 2, we can see that you're present. And then if we go to page 4, you are invited by the Foreign Secretary, he's of course deputising for the Prime Minister at that time, to present on the non-shielded vulnerable programme. And if we go down to the bottom of what we currently have up, you'll see the final paragraph. Continuing, Simon Case Cabinet Office said, the 3 areas where there was the highest risk of the government failing to meet the needs of non-shielded vulnerable individuals were, and the second one is domestic abuse, where the risk was acute. So that was your view.
Yes.
And you were concerned that they were failing, government was failing to meet those needs.
Correct. I think I won't explain. It's very clear that if people couldn't get out of their home, that the victims of domestic abuse were, the risk was going to be acute if they couldn't.
Yes.
They couldn't get out of their houses.
And if we can just stay on that document for a moment and go to page 6. I don't know, is that up? It's not up on mine.
It's up on mine.
So that is the discussion.
Yes, sorry, this is a cabinet committee, so the way we do this is the points.
In general terms.
They get you don't record who made
No.
the points. Yeah.
No. And if we can scroll down actually to further down that page to paragraph G.
Yeah, got it.
And that's probably, I would guess, a point made by the Home Secretary, although it may be that because it's Cabinet we're not allowed to speculate on that.
I mean, I'd be very sure it was the Home Secretary because, as I mentioned in questioning to Mr. Keith, she was really focused on this and how the Home Office could, what more they could do with the relevant charities. I think they put out more funding for the charities and got the police to think more about how they could assist.
So that she, if we're working on the basis it is her, she does give us the data. The latest data available on the victims of domestic abuse was revealing the scale of the problem, and it's quite telling. Helplines had received a 52% increase in volume of calls, but the demand for refuges and shelters had fallen, indicating that the victims were increasingly unable to leave their abusers. So there was both a demand for help, but difficulty in actually leaving.
Correct.
And
if I'm right, one of the responses I think that was between government and the charitable sector was if I remember it right, was it the Ask for Annie?
That's it. That's next year. That's 2021.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah. But just on that, you were asked and agreed this morning about the inadequacy of data at that time. But is it fair to say that by the 24th of April, Cabinet has the data confirming the rising calls for help and domestic abuse, and therefore confirming the obvious inference that domestic abuse increases as a result of...
Yeah, I think the Home Office were getting this data from relevant charities and passing it to the Cabinet Office.
Yeah. 2 days later, presumably as a result of the discussion at Cabinet, then we have a paper, and I'm not going to put that to you, but you propose that there is a gold SRO in overall coordination of the 10 SROs. You also say that in your witness statement. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, it does.
And it's not clear, either from your witness statement or the documents, whether a gold SRO was ever appointed. Can you help?
I cannot. Is it possible to check these things and come back to the inquiry afterwards? I don't know what the procedure is, but on things like that, which are just factual where I don't know, I'm happy to check and answer the question in writing if needed.
Thank you. There's certainly ways we can do it.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. So that's helpful. We don't know that, but you'll let us know. And then, as you discussed with Mr. Keith, by the end of May, the MIGs are abolished. They're replaced by COVID-O and COVID-S at ministerial level, and later the COVID task force. And are the SROs abolished at the same time?
The SROs, which were largely in departments, continued. Sorry, I have to look this way. Feels very, very rude.
No, whichever is most comfortable.
They continued in departments. Yes, they did.
Right. And you said also this morning that the work on the non-shielded vulnerable continued in the task force, and you struggled for the name, but you thought it was Kay Withers after a while,
that's right.
And then by a small group, you said.
Yes, that's right. I think Simon Ridley addressed this. I think he said it went into the COVID task force under him.
Again, nothing specifically on domestic abuse, either within the SROs or within the COVID task force. Again, we've looked at lists.
Fine. I'll take your word for it.
So would you agree that the work on domestic abuse, which is a subject that several different government departments have various responsibilities for, the Home Office, Department for Levelling Up, Department for Education and so forth, Ministry of Justice, would you agree that work on domestic abuse should really have had a specific coordinator at the centre in times of crisis?
I think in a crisis such as this, that idea of having, I think that's actually a rather good idea.
And is it fair to say that the failure to have a specific coordinator, given that we're now learning the lessons, meant that domestic abuse work effectively fell through the cracks, that the Home Office and the other departments were doing what each one was doing, but nobody was coordinating across government? Is that fair?
My honest answer is I don't know, because I sort of don't know the detail of how the teams across those departments were working together. Actually, I would expect, but this is just an expectation, that they would have been working quite closely together on a subject like this, because they would be working closely together in peacetime, not just in crisis. But certainly, as we've discussed at length, the idea of having sort of somebody in the centre of government whose job title is make sure this all works is a good idea.
And without that, someone in the centre of government, there is a real risk of everybody working in silos, as you put it when you emailed Mr Gove at the beginning of April.
Look, there is, but I refer back to a thing, there's a phenomenon always, which is the centre of government can often believe that if it's not seeing something in government, it's not happening. Actually, there's a lot of often very good working across government that doesn't involve the Cabinet Office or the Prime Minister telling them to. People do just get on with it. But the strength of the point is that I think probably across domestic abuse and the other sorts of groups that we identified through the non-shielded vulnerable programme, having dedicated officers whose job it is to think about that and coordinate would be a good idea.
And this is my very last question. Fair to say that that's why, the working in silos point, that's why on the 24th of April, when you were presenting to Cabinet, you described domestic abuse as one of the areas where there was the highest risk of government failing to meet needs. And I'll just finish the question, then you can reply to both points. And that analysis didn't change throughout the period of COVID, despite the COVID task force, despite COVID-O and COVID-S.
Again, I'm sort of later on, once I become Cabinet Secretary, I'm just not sure I would have seen the detail of what was going on. So I think the thrust I can agree with, but the precise point I just don't. I didn't know from my position the detail of what was going on in the COVID task force to join up departments. I'm sure the analysis was right that there was unmet need, I think particularly in relation to domestic abuse, because of the terrible circumstances that victims must have been in, of being trapped in houses with, or wherever, with abusers. I suspect it's right that there was unmet need.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Davies. The next two questioners are both behind you. Mr Thomas has just stood up. He's behind you to your right. And then it'll be Mr Jacob in front of him.
Can I turn round to
yes,
see the questions and then look back this way?
I won't consider it disrespectful either. So it's probably easier because you can then face the questioner.
Good afternoon, Dr. Case. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I represent FEMHO, Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. I only have a very small handful of questions for you, but let me just briefly set the context. So as the legal representative of FEMHO, one of the things that we are deeply concerned about is the disproportionate impact that the pandemic had on Black, Asian, minority and ethnic communities, particularly given the significant number of healthcare workers from these backgrounds who are right on the front line. Early reports such as that was contained in The Guardian on the 10th of April 2020 highlighted an alarming trend amongst ethnic minority healthcare workers. So I have in mind the report that they were being disproportionately impacted. The first 10 doctors were from ethnic minority, who died, were from ethnic minority backgrounds. And at about this time, with the Prime Minister hospitalised and the absence of clear leadership during his illness, it's vital to understand who within Number 10 was actively addressing this issue. Additionally, it's critical for this inquiry to delve into what the initial understanding was of these disproportionate deaths, whether viewed merely from a physiological anomaly or whether it had a deeper meaning, such as structural issues within the healthcare system. So, can I now turn to the questions? As I say, it's only a handful of questions. In your witness statement at paragraph 2.4, you mentioned presenting on the non-shielded vulnerable programme to the Covid-19 strategy ministerial group on the 24th of April. So this would have been some 2 weeks after that report that I've just mentioned. First question. What specific information did you possess or know regarding the disproportionate impact of the virus on the BAME community, especially considering the significant representation of black, brown healthcare workers on the front line?
So at that time, I don't think I had any information specifically on this. If I remember correctly, the focus on these there's material that I think I've exhibited comes later. I think after the June 2020 PHE report, where we start to focus much more on the disproportionate representation of ethnic minorities by age group. When I was doing the non-shielded vulnerable work, actually, I think the specific issue about healthcare workers, I mean, and this is the silo problem, would have been coming to the health MIG through that route rather than through the non-shielded vulnerable group.
But you agree, as you say, there may have been a bit of a silo there. This is the source of information that should have been shared.
Yeah, I certainly didn't. I remember becoming very conscious of this, as I discussed with Mr. Keith earlier, but it was later. It wasn't April.
There was a Public Health England report in 2019 that was talking about structural racism within the NHS. Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't.
All right. Secondly, in the discussion surrounding the non-shielded vulnerable programme to the COVID-19 strategy ministerial group, was ethnicity acknowledged as a potential risk factor contributing to the significant disproportionate impact on these communities?
I don't remember it being, but I'd want to check notes and minutes of the meeting to be sure, but I don't think it was.
Thirdly, given the absence of the Prime Minister due to his hospitalisation from the 5th of April to the 26th of April, was the surge in the disproportionate deaths within the BAME community recognised as an urgent matter, particularly concerning frontline healthcare workers, the very people we were clapping for every Thursday?
So I don't think I would have had visibility of it if it was, obviously the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, had taken the Prime Minister's place whilst he was ill and the team was working. But I'm afraid at that time I could see what I was working on, the non-shielded vulnerables. I couldn't see myself what was going on in other bits of the forest. So I'm not sure I can actually help you with apologies.
You may have touched upon my last question, but let me put it to you just to see if you have, which is, who, if anyone, held the highest authority in addressing the disproportionate impact on the BAME communities and the safety of frontline healthcare workers during the Prime Minister's absence?
Again, I'm not sure, as I say, the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, had the overall control.
You seem a little bit uncertain about that.
Yeah, I actually don't know who would have been the Equalities Minister at that time, but it also would have been with Matt Hancock, of course, as Health Secretary in relation to health workers.
Respectfully, there seems to be some hesitancy. That might just be down to the passage of time, but equally it might be because there was genuine confusion about who held this brief. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it could have been. Actually, my hesitation is because I wasn't there, and I'm trying to cast my mind back to actually what I have direct knowledge of. And I have limited direct knowledge, and I just don't want to mislead you in my answers.
I understand. Let me finish with this. Would you agree with this? Certainly, those who I represent have the perception that little was done, despite the fact that knowledge was there, and I've given you the alarming article about the first black and brown doctors who died were black or brown. Would you agree that, looking back on this, there does appear to be some dilatoriness in terms of addressing this? Would that be?
Yeah, and I think I sort of said similar to Mr. Keith this morning. I don't know whether it was your exchange or one of your colleagues' exchange with Simon Ridley about the development of the work on our ethnic minority groups. I touched on it this morning. It was one of the areas where I think we were too slow.
Yeah. Dr. Case, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Jacobs.
Good afternoon, Dr. Case. I ask questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. We're going to look, if we may, at page 144 of Sir Patrick Valance's diaries. It's an entry from the 12th of August 2020. It refers to a meeting in which you were present with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Cummings, and others. What it says is, we suggested that more carrot and incentives required to make people take a test, self-isolate, etc. But they always want to go for stick, not carrot. Firstly, the carrot that was referred to in that meeting, would that include financial support for those self-isolating?
Yeah, again, sorry for turning my back on you whilst I answer. Yeah, that's exactly right. There was a very big debate all the way through August, September, and I think even into October, possibly even longer, about financial support for those who were self-isolating. Test and Trace, who were sort of in the lead, I think were consistently saying that the financial support for those self-isolating wasn't enough.
And was the idea in general terms that those on lower incomes who also happen to be working in care homes, in transport, in supermarkets, etc., may struggle to have no or restricted pay for 2 weeks? Yeah,
that was the point that I remember Dido Harding and her team making, yes.
And is Sir Patrick's impression of that big debate, as you describe it, a fair one, namely that they always want to go for the stick and not the carrot?
It's sort of obviously difficult to comment on someone else's words, as I don't quite know who he means by they. But, you know, as I say, I think the characterisation of it taking a lot of pushing from the Test and Trace organisation to increase the financial support. It went on for a long time. I think in the end there was resolution. It was a discussion that largely happened between the Test and Trace team and the Treasury directly, if I remember correctly. But I recognise the point.
Yes. Let's hazard a guess that by they he means the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. Would it have been your impression that the instinct was to reach for the stick and not the carrot?
This is August. I mean, certainly at this time, the former Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, was very focused on enforcement. I think around this time, he'd had a meeting with chief constables, with the Home Secretary. It was very much, get people to comply. At that time, I don't think that was his view all the way through. I think the Chancellor was always doing the Chancellor's job, which is, I'll pay for things if you can show that they deliver value for money, so please show me the evidence they'll work.
Okay. One observation you made in your evidence earlier this afternoon was a lower income workforce which is disproportionately young, female and ethnic minority. Do you think there was adequate consideration of that as a feature, and whether financial support for self-isolation may be a part of addressing some of that disproportionate impact?
That point was definitely discussed more broadly, but I certainly in the discussions, and there wouldn't have been many that I was in on this, I don't remember that featuring particularly in this particular discussion around self-isolation. As I said, I have to be careful that a lot of these conversations, I would have been in the discussions with ministers, but there would have been a lot of discussions outside, and so, official to official, that I may not have been party to where that was discussed, but I don't remember it being discussed particularly.
Put simply, should it have been?
Yes.
And those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. I think that completes the questioning for Dr. Case, Mr. Keith.
Lydia does.
Thank you very much, Dr. Case. I'm really grateful to you. It's been a long day for you. I hope it hasn't been too much occasionally like a seminar when I've got involved.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was my fault.
No, I asked you the questions. But I'm delighted to see that your health seems to be improving. So thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Right, that now completes the oral evidence for Module 2. The bulk of which, of course, we concluded last December. Since then, I've heard evidence in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and most recently in Belfast, and I can assure the members of the public that the inquiry teams for each module have already begun work on producing their analysis of the evidence, both written and oral, and I will consider all the evidence that has been gathered and the submissions before reaching any conclusions. There may be submissions as a result, additional submissions as a result of Dr. Case's evidence today, and I will happily receive them. We are close to publishing the report for Module 1, and I will publish the report for Module 2, 2A, 2B and 2C as soon as we reasonably can. But I should say this, that as I went around the United Kingdom, although I understood clearly the distinct differences in the context of each devolved nation, I also detected a large number of common themes. And I have decided that because of the number of common themes, to save duplication and to try and get the report out as quickly as possible, I will address them in a single report. But I want to reassure the people of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that in doing so, I will ensure that the issues specific to their country are properly addressed. So I'd like to conclude by thanking again all those who have been involved in the hearings for modules 2, 2A, B and C, all the witnesses, the material providers, the core participants and their legal teams, and of course to the inquiry team. We could not have completed the hearings without everyone's very substantial assistance. I do know that the inquiry makes great demands on people and organisations, and that I have set a very challenging timetable. This, I'm afraid, is a consequence of the extremely broad terms of reference set by Mr. Johnson as Prime Minister, and of my determination to fulfil those broad terms of reference within a reasonable time frame. I hope to make recommendations where appropriate to make the United Kingdom and the devolved nations better able to face threats such as the COVID pandemic in the future. And I want to make those recommendations before the memories of some fade. So thank you all very much. And I think the next substantive hearings will commence in Module 3, the healthcare module, at the beginning of September, September the 9th, I think it is. There will be other hearings, preliminary hearings, but those will be the next evidential hearings. So thank you all.
Thank you, my lady.